Yeah, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see many of you. As you know, this is a part of the induction week for urban planning and geography and planning students. And as part of it, we thought about organizing again this year, as same as last year, a film screening with a discussion and also you as students attending. With a film that we think it will be really interesting and stimulating, and the panel discussion as well. So the film that we're going to screen is a documentary film called The Pruitt Igoe Myth, produced in 2011 by Chad Friedrich, who also has produced other documentary films. And it is, as you may kind of guess through by the image, about a housing estate that was demolished in the city of St. Louis in the United States. It was a large public housing development built in the mid-20th century at the height of the welfare state in the North Atlantic countries, so where the state was very much a provider of services, including housing. And this development is particularly famous because of the following image, this one. It became almost like a symbol of the failure of both modernist architecture and also of the welfare state, of the state as providing these basic public services to people. So the narrative that is usually provided or given to explain why this development failed usually focus on design elements, poor design, bad construction, etc. But also on the failure of the state in terms of being able to provide this housing, and even the nature and the behavior of the residents, which were in this case the Black urban poor, right? So what the film does, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but just to give you an idea, is to challenge this narrative and propose an alternative or maybe a more complete explanation of what happened. So it is basically an invitation to think perhaps differently about social housing. It is very relevant, we think, to current housing debates in the UK, where, as you may also know, there's a stigmatization of social housing states, and many of these projects have also failed. They have been demolished, rebuilt, etc. So there's, we think, a lot of relevance for the context of the UK. So we are going to share the screening. I'm just going to, in a moment, to give you a series of questions to think about while you watch it. And then after that, we will have a panel discussions with two staff members from APL, from the School of Planning, Architecture, Planning and Landscape, Miranda Josifidis and Luce Pauls, and James Richardson from the City University of New York, which you may have heard and seen just before we started this, and who has very kindly agreed to participate and give us a very, a perspective from those types of contexts. So before we start showing the film, we wanted to propose a series of questions for you to think as you watch the film. Abby is going to write them down in the chat, so you can refer to them while we watch the film. So if you click on the bottom bar, you should be able to see them soon. And they're basically about, what is the film saying? So what are the reasons for this development to be built in the first place? You will see that it was built in a very particular context, with the city growing and expectations for, rural migrants and people moving into the city to work in the industries. But anyway, it's a bit more complicated than that, as you will see. What were the benefits for the tenants? You will see a lot of perspectives directly from those that live there. So think about how they saw those developments rather than perhaps what you would think if you were to move there now. What are the apparent reasons for the failure of the housing project? So what the filmmaker is trying to explain that led to the failure of this project. what role did racism play in the development and decline of the project? You will see that race is a dimension or a category that is very, very much present. And then think also a bit critically in terms of, are you convinced by what the filmmaker is trying to say? Are there perhaps any gaps in the argument? And maybe that also will lead you to think about questions or prompts that you're welcome to put forward after the screening during the panel discussion. So yeah, so how this is going to work, and I'm just going to stop sharing, is that I will share the film directly from my computer, so you don't have to go anywhere. Hopefully everything is going to work okay. If you have questions or thoughts, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and we can pick them up and address them later. And after the screening, we'll invite James, Luce, and Miranda to start with some provocations, with some responses to the film, and then we will open up for the discussion. Is that everything clear? Abby, did I miss anything?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Okay, great. Perhaps I should have clarified that Abby and I are, as you may know, the DPDs of Geography and Planning and Urban Planning, so we are coordinating this. Okay, so I am going to now share the film. We'll start watching it, and we will see each other in approximately an hour and a half. So.
Wow. Well, I hope everyone is still, dry-eyed at the end of that, because it's sometimes hard to speak after a documentary as powerful as that. But I just wanted to say we have actually ended up with a little bit of extra time. We always build in a little bit of padding at this kind of event, just in case of technical problems. So I'm really happy about that. I have had an email from Luce, who will be connecting shortly. And Miranda, is Miranda here? Because I don't see under the list of participant names, but I know sometimes people's names are not correct. So, okay, so what I'm going to do, and it would be great if students could now put their cameras on, or faculty who are here, and just show that we're here, just for a moment, and then it's okay if people have some connectivity issues or anything like that, but sometimes it's nice just to feel that we're together, even if some of us are 3,000 miles away, right, James? So what I'm going to do is, so I think that Miranda may be having some connection issues, so I'm going to slightly shift the order of our panel, but I am going to introduce the panelists who we have. But James, I'm going to ask if you can go first, because I think that that Miranda may be having a little trouble. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is just give you a very brief introduction to who we're going to have here on our panel today. So first of all, Miranda Iosifidis, who'll be with us shortly, unless she's got some terrible connection problem, is an urban sociologist who has an interest in the intersection between film and housing struggles, so how housing struggles are showed through film. She's organised many film screenings with activists, filmmakers and academics around London and what's going on with housing in London. So Miranda's based in our department. She's a researcher, and so many of you may have had a chance to meet her. Now, who you won't have had a chance to meet in person is a former colleague and friend of mine, James Richardson, who we're really privileged to have with us today. James is an associate professor of new media technology and a former director of online programs at the City University of New York. So he's coming in live from New York City, and he was born and raised in Harlem. And he's got several decades of experience in mentoring urban youth who've come through this experience, this type of experience that was seen in the documentary. And then we have Luce Velpas, who is, oh, there she is, yay, hi Luce. So there's Luce, and Luce is also in our department. She's a lecturer in architecture and urban planning, and with a particular focus on the relations between people and heritage. Her research is driven by a concern with the ethics of care and the way in which injustice is reproduced. So what we're going to do is we're going to give each of our panelists a little time to react and respond to what we've seen, and also sort of building on some of the issues that have been raised from their own perspective and their own experience. I'm going to start with James, because like I say, I think Miranda, who was going to go first, must be having some kind of connectivity issue. So James, if you want to jump in, and I'm just warning you, as we spoke about earlier, at about 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a little verbal interruption if we need to. All right, thanks again, James. Go ahead.
And you probably will. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Video stream's good. I just wanted to say that it was an amazing documentary. The thing that troubled me more than anything else is that how little things have changed since Pruitt Igoe was torn down. The story that you essentially heard, at least from my perspective, from the American urban city perspective, was fairly common. Not every housing project was torn down in the US, but the issues that they have, that initial hope that people had moving into these newer constructions. I think that the idea behind these projects were well-intentioned, extremely well-intentioned, to give people who needed affordable, safe housing a place to basically live. The problem is, and I don't know if this is an inherently an American experience, but it's that whole concept of giving somebody something for free, which kind of rubs up against the American ideal. Nothing should be given for free. That's not housing, that's not healthcare, that's not education, any of the things that lead societies to improve. I think we can all agree that education is a good thing. And throughout most of Europe that I've seen, a lot of your higher educational experiences are a lot more affordable than what we have here. Same thing with healthcare. The US is one of the few places that doesn't have healthcare, free healthcare, or government-sponsored healthcare. And the same thing translates now to housing. These are basic needs that people have, and the idea behind it was to give them free housing, but where they stopped short, and I think this was an important part that was mentioned in the documentary, was the maintenance. We build it, and then we don't give you any type of method in terms of maintaining it moving forward. And that's short-sighted in the extreme. And I've seen this with a lot of housing developments. I actually was part of, I didn't grow up in the projects, but I did grow up in government-funded housing. And there's a thing which we call in the US called Mitchell-Lama co-ops, where instead of, just free rental places, the government basically subsidized low-cost condominiums and co-ops for people to live in. So it was basically for the middle class. And, that worked a little bit better in some ways because people had actual ownership in their apartments, supposedly. It worked a little bit better, but there was always that issue of using the tax base, using the money from your rent per se to maintain the apartments moving forward. And that's something that we've always kind of struggled with here. The other thing I would like to say is that there was a certain stigmatization with living in the projects, and it still exists to this day. And I can't speak once again to the UK experience, but in the US, definitely where you live gives people an idea of how much respect to afford you. So if I say that I live on Park Avenue, there's a certain idea or Fifth Avenue in the U.S. in New York City, some of the most expensive real estate in the country. If I say I live on Park Avenue, people expect a certain thing. If I say I live in Harlem, there's a very different connotation, at least when I was growing up. Harlem's become way more gentrified as of late, which I find hilarious because, you know, when I went to school, and I went to a private school downtown with predominantly white kids, and I can almost count on one hand the number of kids who came to visit me at my home. They were like, we can't go up to Harlem. And, you know, like you would be eaten alive or something like that. But what I find hilarious now is that Harlem has been through a massive gentrification. And you have tons of white people living in Harlem now who claim Harlem as their own, which pisses me off. You know, I digress. I remember thinking very long and hard that, you know, one of the things that my parents, my mom in particular, drilled into me is to, you know, get a good education, do whatever you can to, quote unquote, I don't say get out of the neighborhood, but we always wanted to move to better surroundings. And now at 56 years old, I would have to struggle to get into Harlem to afford a place to live there. So that's, you know, we wound up, we bought a place a few years ago. We moved to the North Bronx to gentrify this particular area. And it's, you know, there's this whole stigma about where you live. And those are the things that we have to basically, those type of barriers, that type of inherent racism that people have towards you live here. So there's a certain expectation about how your lifestyle is, or how you are as a person, or what type of morals that you have. Racism, definitely in the US, permeates almost every aspect of our society. And I found that even my own kids, and we're relatively privileged. You know, this is not, where I live is not essentially the ghetto. You know, we have well-paying jobs. My family routinely travels overseas during the summer to summer in the Scandinavian areas of the world. So I have a different experience. But however, I remember when we bought our apartment in the North Bronx, my son was very upset. My son was upset because the school that he went to, which was, of course, you know, upscale and white, all of a sudden, we moved out of Manhattan, and many of his friends who used to come and visit him at our home would no longer feel, quote unquote, comfortable coming to the North Bronx. That's too distant. And he had to deal with some issues in terms of where you live does not determine who you are. To be affected by those type of things, you know, and there's a certain, like, I never, even when Harlem was at its worst, when, you know, there was issues in terms of crime, drugs, all of those things, I never was ashamed about living in Harlem. And that's something we saw kind of spoken about in the documentary, when the older Black woman toward the end, and she was talking about how it was a party and how there were so many good experiences and stuff that she grew up with. You know, I look back on my time living, and my mom still lives in the same place where I grew up, and I go to visit her regularly. There's a lot of good memories. There were friends. There's people in the building who I knew. There was Mr. Austin, who lived at the end of the hall. There was Fatima and her mother, who were, you know, devout Muslims who lived at the other end of the hall. We knew the people across the hall, directly across the hall from us, Grace and John, both who have since passed away. You know, we all knew one another. We looked out for one another. There was a sense of community, which I've had a hard time replicating after I moved out. Where there's places in New York where, you know, especially where you rent, where you don't know your neighbors across the hall. You don't want to know them, you know. There wasn't that type of community. And that's one thing that I did miss once moving out, is knowing everyone who was around. I have most of my friends and family grew up in public housing. Many of my best friends grew up in public housing. And I remember seeing friends of mine who lived in the Bronx, and I would go visit them at their homes. And it was, you knew everybody on the block. You knew the guys across. So it wasn't all bad. And yeah, there was drugs, you know, especially in the public housing when they were talking about like breaking the lights and the elevators not working. You know, I would go visit my aunt sometimes who was in the projects, and her elevators went out or didn't work regularly. And I believe I can't remember, she was like on the 7th floor. So like, you got to walk up 7 flights to see it on dark hallways. And you were always worried, like, you know, are you going to get jumped in the hallways? You know, especially older people, you know. So there was always that type of anger, that type of danger. But interspersed with a lot of that was also a lot of positive experiences. So to sum up, because I know I've been rambling on, I don't want to talk on forever. The thing that, as many of you who are thinking about becoming urban planners, who are developing things for housing, whether it be affordable, whether it be for, you know, accessibility issues, is that in addition to just building these developments, projects, housing complexes, the other major thing that needs to be seriously considered is, how do you maintain those moving forward? What type of services do you provide to help people who may not have owned their own place in the past to take ownership in where they're living? If I'm living somewhere, oh, think about it. Like, if any of you have ever rented a car rental places. I used to rent cars when I traveled with my other job many times. And I would always get happy when they would give me a really upscale car, a car that I probably couldn't have afforded at the time, like you know, a Mercedes or a Mustang. I remember one time I had a Mustang, like a really high-end, powerful Mustang. And I rented it for 3 days and I beat the hell out of that car. I drove it around. It wasn't mine. As long as I didn't crash it up, I, you know, returned it in relatively decent, you know, I didn't care about it. It wasn't mine. So I sped everywhere. I spun out the tires. You know, the same thing is true if you don't own the place that you live. Sometimes people don't see that this is important. This is where I'm going to come and lay my head. I have to take care of this. If they don't feel that people care about them, if they don't feel that they have any ownership in the place where they're at, they're not going to care. And also the other thing that really touched for me, and this is the last piece that I'm going to speak on, was some of the social issues that they kind of tied to living in these projects, such as you couldn't have an able-bodied male living in the apartment. And that was absolutely true for tons of US-based housing projects. So what they essentially did was they took the male role model out of the house, made it difficult for a lot of the young males to have a positive male influence in terms of how to behave, how to react, how to handle conflict. This is why sometimes you see these overreactions in a lot of areas, where if someone steps on my sneakers or says something to me disrespectful, it goes beyond just kind of like wordplay, me telling you to, you know, I guess you guys would say bugger off, right? You know, it goes beyond to something absolutely more dangerous and more violent, because you have to protect who you are, because that's all that you have, your sense of self, your reputation. And by taking the male figures out of the house, a lot of the younger gentlemen never learned how to deal with those type of conflict resolutions. Like when the woman was talking about, the gentleman was talking about his mother made him go down and fight. It really kind of resonated with me, because I remember my father doing the same thing with me. Kids stole my skateboard. I came upstairs because I was short, and at the time, short and heavy set. And I came upstairs crying. And my father said, you have to go down there, find them. And he took me down there. I found a group of dudes who stole my skateboard, and my father made me fight 3 of them. 3 of them, one after the other. I beat the first 2. The third one knocked me out like coal. Which, anyway, I digress. I still got flashbacks about that. So you learn very early on to be very macho, more, to even if that's not your natural inclination. So the social policies that they put in place didn't help. So to just sum up, last thing, for those of you who are planning to develop these type of developments, in terms of getting the funding to build them, that's the first step. It's an important step, but just the first one. You have to also figure out ways to maintain the properties moving forward. How are they going to be self-sustaining beyond just the income, the money that comes in through the rents or the maintenance fees that are paid? There needs to be some type of safety net to make sure that the places are always well maintained. The third is to make sure that there are not social policies put in place that are disruptive to the family structure, and that those who have had no previous experience in owning property, that there's some ways of encouraging ownership, encouraging pride in where you live. And that's what I would say is some of the, at least at a top level, some of the major issues that I've seen with the well-meaning policies of the housing preservation departments in the US.
Thanks, James. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for bringing that raw perspective, but also analytical perspective on that experience, and certainly being able to offer that African-American perspective on what we've just seen, because I think it is, like I said, a privilege to be able to have that immediate reaction as well. When you talked about the way this particular film resonated with that experience, so that was great, and it's also great that we've got Miranda with us and Luce. And we're going to go to Luce next and then Miranda. And what we're doing here is, again, we're sort of getting these initial responses, speaking to some of the themes and issues that have been raised in the documentary. And then right after that, we're going to be opening things up to the floor so that anyone that's here can ask a question. And it's sometimes quite a little bit daunting. Particularly some of you have only arrived in the last couple of days at university, but I'm really hoping that some of you will find it possible to ask a question to our panel. So feel free, if you've got a question in your mind, to type it into the chat, because sometimes that makes it easier to ask the question as well. Let's keep it rolling. And we're going to move to Luce now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you, Abby and Diego, for inviting us. And thanks, James, for that response, because I think that was, I totally agree. It's an amazing documentary, and it's really good to also hear, because of course it's an American situation, an American context, especially a Black American context. So it's really important to hear your experience and knowledge about this. And I don't know if I can really speak for being Dutch, I don't know if I can really speak for the British experience. But I think what is so interesting about the documentary is really rich in explaining how urban planning works, but also doesn't work, right? It's really showing how it pulls a lot of these things together. It's not just building a few blocks. It's policies that are put in place, as you just said, like no men in these buildings, which is incredibly disruptive to social structures, to family structures. There was another thing, I think. Well, there are several things in place that kind of like make the place what it is. That goes far beyond architecture or urban planning, I think. And I think this is really important. This is a really important thing to understand about urban planning, right? Urban planning is much more than planning the shape of the urban or even the policy of the urban, you know, and that all these policies have very strong implications, and the whole thing about maintenance and care, I think, is also really, really important in the sense that, and this is of course a bit more my topic, in the sense that if you don't maintain, if you don't care for buildings, that is not just saying, you know, as they explain in the documentary, right, that it's to some extent it was an agreement between the city and the property developers that the city could pay for building it, but they couldn't pay for maintenance. And well, maybe I'm a bit skeptical here, but I feel like that's very much on purpose by the property developers, because they know what the outcome is going to be of doing that. They know that it's going to mean there is no maintenance of these places, and therefore they are going to not be no money for these kind of places, so they won't be maintained, which means they will become, you know, a bit, well, not very well maintained. You all know what places that like that look like, right? They may be amazing places to live for some people, but from the outside it looks like a weird place that maybe you feel uncomfortable going. So to do that kind of on purpose also kind of means that you know, property developers can then kind of say, that terrible place is not the one you want to live, even though maybe the rents are cheap. You want to come to my newly flashy developed place that I can sell you a mortgage for, and I can, you know, so there is this whole play of the private market versus the social market. And it goes back to what you said before, James, like the whole idea that you can't give people things for free, or that you, of course, it's not for free because they still pay rent, and but all these, yeah, it's just really important. And the maintenance and care part for me is really important. And it's not just maintenance, but it's also, who do you care for through not, or would you not care for through not caring for these places? So it's not just saying something about how you care for the urban, it's also how you care for the people that are living there, that have their daily lives there, that you are interfering with constantly, or kind of maybe not interfering, you are kind of like making their lives really difficult. And this is, I think it's really important. And these things are happening here as well, right? So it's interesting to watch this documentary and to kind of see how it happens in another place. But I think we shouldn't forget that this is also happening in the UK and also happening in the Netherlands and in many, many other places. So it's not unique at all. It will have different kind of like slightly different elements to it, but the same thing. I mean, even here in Gateshead, where I am at the moment, but also in Newcastle, there are examples of places that were built in the 50s or 60s and demolished in the 70s or 80s or 90s, that were built with this whole idea of like, oh, we have a new world, we're building a new world. And then like after 25, 30 years, people are being displaced, people are being taken out, and places are being demolished again. So I think, and all over the UK, because there is, you know, yeah, here you have St. Cuthbert's Village in Gateshead, you have some of the Noble Street flats in Newcastle and Scotswood, but then the Gorbals, I think, is a really interesting example in Glasgow. But then on the other hand, you also have these kind of weird other examples where in Sheffield, you have the Park Hill flat that is now a listed building. So it's a very similar kind of development, but then all of a sudden they become listed. Or the facade of the, what is the name? That went to the V&A.
Robin Hood.
Yes, Robin Hood Gardens. The facade of this building becomes part of a museum collection. And in other places, people are being pushed out and disregarded. Yeah, I think it's easy to think about it as something that happened somewhere else, but we really need to think about it as something that happened here and happens here. Some of these places here in Gateshead have been demolished as recently as 2015, I think. And then there is the promise of new development, but it's still empty land. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there's many things. I think I thought it was a really good documentary to kind of really understand, and not just in the US, but also really here. And the racial politics in the UK are different from the US, of course, but they also play into this. The class politics are really important and play strongly into this. Yeah, there is loads of things that really overlap and that are really important to think about. I think I'll leave it at this for now. We can talk more later.
Thanks, Luce. That's great to have your take on the both the film and the more sort of sociological context, as well as that popping over to the Dutch context as well. So I think this reach of this documentary and where we're seeing these resonances, you know, across national contexts is really important. And towards the end, I'm going to be putting a couple of readings in the chat that I think help us to make that leap into the UK context, as well as a couple that maybe expand a bit more on the documentary. I'm going to move now to Miranda, who's also going to give her reaction, and then Diego's gonna he's got some questions that he's going to pose to the panel as well. And again, I'm starting to see some questions coming in the chat from students, so that's absolutely fantastic. Feel free to keep adding to that, and we'll have some time to discuss when we open the floor. Thanks again. So Miranda, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I thought it was an interesting documentary, but it also annoyed me in many ways. So I think, but I think it raised a lot of questions, which I think is good. I think that's what documentary should be about, raising questions and aggravating you so that you kind of have a engaged response and action with it. So I'm really interested in the ways in which films can be thought of as part of housing movements and struggles and how they can be useful or mobilizing, but also kind of vividly and intimately share experiences of residents in a way like no other art form. And, you know, in the UK, especially since 2010, there's been big housing movement because of the housing crisis, especially in London, where I was based for many years. And so there are quite a lot of films made here during that time that are trying to do that. And so I'm really interested in sort of kind of, yeah, engaging with some of the themes that the film highlights. And so I wanted to hear more from residents, and in particular, their other hats. So it's implicitly shared that the older woman was a community organizer. And I wanted to hear so much more about the rent strike. And I read about this afterwards in an article. The film repetitively showed the image of the buildings being demolished rather than any domestic or joyful scenes of everyday life in Pruitt Igoe. And I thought that was a real shame in the sense that it's sort of, in what ways does that dismantle or disrupt the dominant understanding of Pruitt Igoe and public housing in terms, you know, this sort of iconic image. And it also made me think of the first scene of The Wire, where you see that happening too. And in particular, season 3 of The Wire does so much more than this film to pick apart the corruption and the different layers of the state and the interactions and the private developers, like the things that Luce was talking about, but also the sort of everyday life and the joyful community that James was talking about too. So I think in terms of, I'm really invested in audiovisual art form as ways of intervening in social, political, and economic issues and activating audiences in different ways. So even though I'm kind of critical of this documentary, I'm not saying that it's bad. So I think it could have done a much better job of thinking about the role of the state. So at the end of the film, the older woman, who I'm just going to call community organizer, said that she never stopped caring for the place, which Luce touched upon. And this lack of care is central to thinking about the role of the state of Missouri and the St. Louis Housing Authority, the relationship between the two in relation to the residents of Pruitt Igoe. I think it could have done a much better job of thinking about structural racism, and redlining, for example, was never mentioned. But, you know, I've taught redlining before, so I knew that it was there. And so I think a lot of things were implicit that they could have made way more explicit. So, you know, redlining central to racist state practices and the racial residential segregation and housing conditions of Pruitt Igoe residents. And it continues to, you know, there's so much research about the ways in which it's the legacy of redlining and the impact today in the States. So the documentary, I think, still focused on a narrative where people and jobs just naturally or magically move, so suburbanization magically takes place. But, the work on suburbanization shows a closer examination of selective credit programs reveals the state was instrumental in creating and popularizing this powerful narrative about metropolitan change. The story was that it's kind of impersonal and value neutral markets, not white people, that made racial segregation necessary. So making certain areas valuable and others not, redlining practice was crucial to this. And suburbanization and neoliberalization are entwined. And I think that the film really could have pushed a bit harder on this. So you have the questions constantly like, why are we here? Why are we being treated this way? And, the art, they could have done a bit more in sort of highlighting the structural reasons as to why that is. And I wanted to know more about the role of the state with regards to families having to live without their fathers. The domestic scenes, I wanted to see more. The snapshots that they showed, they really overdid this visual narrative we've seen again and again, black and white, fear, danger, crime. I want to see what the people were talking about, like the everyday life and the kind of how people were living, and predominantly Black women-led households. So I made me want to dig deeper. So I've read an article about remembering the Black women in Pruitt Igoe, and Candace Borders writes that, by 1959, women headed the majority of households, and state-sanctioned surveillance was a constant feature in their lives of the women. So the state attempted to safeguard against families who refused to adhere to the welfare office's white middle-class standard of living. So you see, it's kind of, these practices are shocking, but it continues, and there's a line, in terms of moralism and class and race, in terms of trying to shape people according to the state. So what I thought was really interesting and that the film could have kind of highlighted more was, she writes that Black mothers devised ways to make do in Pruitt Igoe and remapped meaning onto what had become a carceral space. Every Saturday, mothers in the buildings gathered together and everybody pulled their weight. They cleaned every floor of the building and a nearby playground. Known as Operation Brightside, the cleaning effort took place in many buildings with Black women at the helm. Their cleaning activities responded to state-enforced neglect of the housing project and functioned as a way for Black women to assert agency over the deteriorating conditions in the hallways, etc. And those women who organized Operation Brightside transformed communal spaces where strategies for survival and resistance were exchanged. So this intentional altering of the physical environment of Pruitt Igoe operated as a mode of survival and a way for Black mothers to construct a community of resistance in spite of the oppression embodied by the housing project. And I want to know more about community organizing. So I read another article about St. Louis rent strike, which links those struggles to contemporary housing struggles. It's super interesting to bring back to what James was saying about what happens to notions of community when you're not in a public housing project. It means that actually now it's harder to organize in terms of similarly bad housing conditions. So this iconic nationally televised demolition also marked a shift not only in the structural form of public housing, but in the financial framework of low-income housing. So Section 8 began, where then you got housing authorities and private rental markets like you see in the UK. So again, you still have terrible housing conditions. It makes it harder to organize. So in the 60s, tenants next door down the hall would talk to their neighbors about conditions and organize, and it's easier to organize. Whereas now, obviously, it's a bit more difficult, but it's really interesting. I can share these links about ways in which that tie these different histories together and thinking about the incredible stuff that people were doing at that time. And in terms of the UK, it also made me think of this film, The Great Housing Disaster by Adam Curtis. It's from 1984, but I saw it in an occupation of the Focus E15 women in Carpenter's Estate, which is right next to the Olympics, that they were occupying to kind of stop the local council was trying to evict them and kind of only would rehouse them outside of London. So that's what you see in London a lot, people saying, okay, we're going to demolish this space and now you're going to be moved across the country, far away from your networks, far away from any family and friends. So you see this like, I thought it was I thought the film was interesting, but very annoying as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to watch it, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you all.
Thanks, Miranda. That was amazing, because when I hear someone like Miranda speak, I always realize what a dope I am, like what a a kind of passive viewer in a way, because as you were speaking, Miranda, about some of those criticisms, I was like, oh right, it didn't mention that, and oh right, it could have done more on that. So so yeah, developing that critical active viewing awareness is something that well, you've certainly just modeled brilliantly, and I think we can all learn from. I think the other thing just meant to just chime in on is you might have noticed that we were watching the film through a system called Canopy, which is with a K, and you can watch the most amazing films and documentaries for free as a Newcastle University student, and really develop that kind of critical awareness that Miranda has just demonstrated of some of the independent, very, very academic films that are out there. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Diego, who, like I said earlier, has a few prompts for our panel, and then we're going to start to mix that in with some questions from the floor as well.
Yeah, thank you, Abby, and thank you, the three panelists, for your really interesting and I think also complementary contributions. I thought about perhaps we have a few questions that we can address in a minute, but because also we have a bit of time, so I thought about asking my question first, maybe, and I could ask many questions, but I think one that I think is quite interesting, both in terms of James's experience and the students' maybe concern about what can be done, is the issue of agency. What can tenants and residents do to improve their living conditions? And we've seen in the film how it's almost like a two-level element here. So there is obviously the association, the building of a tenants association, rent strikes and so on that Miranda also mentioned. But there's also the individual level of actually adapting to a certain environment. And I think James said it very well, even sometimes going against your own nature to be able to thrive and even survive, right? So, and we see in the film that very clearly with these two men that reacted very differently to when their parents told them to fight, whoever was there. So in a way, it's an environment where, where almost like the fittest survives and thrives. So which is, obviously very different from an environment where you're sheltered and you have easy access to education, to health, and you have families that, that provide certain living conditions for you. So I guess my question, and perhaps more directed to James, is that how do you see, with all the ingenuity and resilience and strength that possibly, well, what we saw in the film, the communities that we saw had, how do you see their actual capacity to influence all these wider processes that are kind of hinted at in the film of, certain housing policies, housing laws, finance laws, economic, deindustrialization, suburban flight, and so on. How do you see from your perspective, what's the actual capacity of individuals and associations to change that? It's a very broad question, but I throw it there, and I'll be interested to hear what you think.
I think it's a massive problem. There's a lot of different moving parts. In terms of anything that agencies can, or more government, or even on an individual level, there needs to be certain things that happens from a structural perspective as well as from an individual standpoint. One of the challenges that people had when they didn't have the male figure in the house is, and this is something that was totally missed, is that by moving the male out of the house, the mother, in many cases, especially if the male didn't work or lost his job, which was a sign of what was happening in a lot of large cities as the industrial bases started to move out. There were less jobs for, unskilled workers. So unless you were skilled, you basically did jobs in other ways, or, sometimes illegal ways. But the mothers were also forced to work. So as a result, you didn't have like you had in the suburbs where you had like, stay-at-home mothers when, the father went off to work and it was a single, they could basically maintain the household on one salary. When you had mothers having to work and not having another role model in the house, kids sometimes were left to their own devices. So one of the things that kept a lot of the housing areas that didn't fail was that they usually had like community centers or outreach. There was some type of environment for the kids. Once they finished school, once school got out at 3 o'clock, they were able to be involved in activities that kept them out of trouble, whether it be, basketball leagues or, sports leagues, any type of thing that allowed them to learn different skills, but also not be kind of left on their own. Because if you're working all the time, it's like you don't have time sometimes to watch your kids. And we don't really look at those type of issues. So from a structural standpoint, building community resources so that kids have something to do when the parents aren't home. And that might also be, it's just such a huge individual problem. So from an individual aspect, I would say that from a structural standpoint, there was a lot, and I agree with Miranda, there was a lot of people who wanted this to fail, who actively want these type of environments, these projects to fail. I would suspect the same thing is holding true in London, which has some of the most expensive real estate in the country, in the world. Same thing with New York. This is why Harlem was targeted for gentrification, largely because it was the upper part of Manhattan. It was easily accessible to downtown. And there's people looking, saying, we can't have abandoned buildings or houses here. We can get tons of money if we can convert these. I used to live in a development called Stuyvesant Town, which was right in the heart of Manhattan. Peter Cooper's Stuyvesant Town. I lived there for 18 years. There was a big push for a number of years to get rid of affordable housing in Stuyvesant Town because it was right in the center of the city. If we could get rid of that, we could charge top dollar rents. If we can convert those to co-ops, we could make tons of money. So developers don't like public housing because that basically cuts down on their money. So when you have these projects that fail and, the images of them, blowing up, Pruitt Igoe, they want that because they can say, hey, we tried this. These people can't maintain this stuff on their own. It failed. So now let's privatize everything. And it's that same type of mindset that honestly, in my opinion, destroys the entire US. And we see that even through like the recent pandemic. If we had locked down the first 3 months of our pandemic, pay people to stay home. And that goes back to that thing saying we can't give people, especially those people, free money. If they'd have paid us to stay home, it would have basically burnt out. Now, because we keep doing these half measures, it's extended and caused greater problems for the entire society. We don't have this type of empathy for others who are not like us. We don't look at a long-term solution. Like we're all, and so when you hear them saying like, we're all, I'm sorry to bring it back to America, but we're all Americans, we're all in this together. Hell no, that's not the case. They don't care about us. And once you understand that, and you understand that you're kind of left on your own, it's disheartening. If we pulled together, it would have cost us a lot less money in the long run. They'll spend money on prisons. They'll spend money on, like in the documentary, it was saying making things indestructible, which was absolutely the case. I remember the old basketball courts I used to play on. If you ever see like movies from the US where people are playing basketball outside, they usually have like metal meshes because they're worried about people pulling down the cloth ones. So they make these things out of metal, out of hard things that become hard to destroy because they feel that we're going to basically destroy everything anyway. And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I don't know if I answered your question, Diego. You know, there needs to be a more, I shouldn't say that, Scandinavian approach. Like we travel to Norway and parts of Scandinavia all the time. And they actually do seem to care about, and it's not perfect there, but they actually do seem to care about their citizens. We realize if I keep people educated, if I make sure that people have a decent place to stay and live, if I basically make sure that people have health care, I don't have to worry about diseases running rampant and spreading throughout the population. I don't have to worry about having an uneducated population who can't provide anything to the society. I don't have to worry about people who are homeless, who now, because they have no place to live and eat, commit crimes to survive. You know, they don't look at the long-term effects of not helping people. And in the long run, it just makes things far more expensive, far more difficult, and destroys progress moving forward. And I don't mean to be a downer, but it's one of the reasons why, honestly, I don't think I'm going to retire here in the U.S. And I love New York. I'm born and raised here. There's a part of me that will represent New York to the day I die. But the U.S. in general, it's, and I see elements, and I'm just talking about what I see on the BBC. I see elements of that also in some of your politicians in the UK. And it's kind of horrifying. I'm like, why don't y'all look at what we're doing here? We're doing something wrong. Please don't follow our example. Don't follow our example, please. It's really not good. It's
brilliantly put, James. I absolutely agree, having had, you know, a foot on either side of the pond. All right, yeah, so Diego, keep this going.
So I'm gonna start going through some of the comments, well, all the comments and questions that people are putting on the chat. So the first one was from Rufus. He says the film was really eye-opening. It didn't really say if the general feeling was that the building should have been knocked down or not. I mean, panelists are welcome to comment on that. I guess my feeling was, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is, what is the general feeling, right? Is the general feelings of the tenants, or, you know, the local authority, the wider society, etc. And in any case, if it's about the tenants, it seemed to me that there was a point where, you know, some of the tenants were saying, well, you know, if there was no way out of this, people were just moving out. I wanted to move out. I guess the problem was possibly, I mean, the key issue was before, you know, about creating the conditions for either the project going on or not. And then the other question, before I open it to whoever wants to comment on it, should they have had more government funding to fix the problem, or could they have been sold off, perhaps? So that's an interesting question also about ownership that Sam was mentioning in one of the comments before. So yeah, I wonder whether anyone would like to comment on, I guess particularly in this one, the issue of ownership and who should own these places, and would that solve the issue?
And nice to see you, Rufus. Is that encapsulate everything you wanted to say, or is there anything you want to add in person?
No, that was just sort of, as Miranda outlined, it was sort of obsessed with that, you know, falling down scene at the end, and I was just wondering whether or not that was the inevitable final solution, if you know what I mean, or if there was any, you know, because it never said if the, you know, it's, I mean, it mentioned that resident was very upset when she had to see it get knocked down, but not whether or not people thought there was another solution. I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts on if it could have been fixed in any way, shape, or form.
Nice one.
I think saying it can't be fixed kind of implies that we have no control over what happens in our society, which is weird, right? So we are developing these policies, and we are, and by we, I really mean we. It's a few policy makers somewhere, but you are going to be those policymakers, right? So we are developing these conditions so we can change these conditions. And whether we do this through a stronger welfare state or to community organizing, you know, there's different ways of addressing that, but I don't think we can, I don't think we should pretend like we have no influence in those systems. Like, they don't just happen to us. A lot happens to people, and it's really hard to organize, but we can organize and do something about it. And I think it's quite interesting to see last year, the rent strikes by students. There is ACORN, the renters union in the UK, that kind of supports people to do this kind of stuff. There is stuff happening, I think, also here. That you can really influence these processes. And as Miranda said, like, people were doing it there. And actually, by demolishing that building, you kind of erase the history of these kind of things that happened, that there was actual, you know, that people were community organizing and trying to make it a better place to live and trying to implement some care regimes to make it a livable place. The demolition to me also feels like it was presented in the documentary a bit of it's easy, I don't know, you know, it's easy to kind of portray it as inevitable, and it never is.
It's interesting that, sorry to like butt it, there was a quote at the beginning from the guy who came round from the, I can't remember the name of the association, but who originally set it up, and he actually said, what do you say? There's not much we can do about it. There was that small interview piece right at the beginning, which, yeah, that interesting after what you just said about, you know, if we can be held responsible. Yeah.
Miranda, would you like to?
Oh yeah, just to build on that, I think, you know, people were invited to the demolition. It was a performative event. It was saying, look, this failed, don't do it again. But and there's always, money can be spent. We can look in the UK at Grenfell, right? The cladding that was on Grenfell Tower is on numerous buildings across the UK still now, you know, years on. Nothing's been done about it. Why? Because we think of housing as a commodity. Housing's been financialized. So it's tied to this, you know, UK and US are probably the worst examples of the world in terms of neoliberal capitalism and thinking about housing as commodity. And so I think we have to do a lot to sort of unlearn that, because that's the society in which we are, you know, if you grow up here or in the States, that's what's all around you. And housing is a fundamental right. So public housing should, you know, it's stigmatized within that in neoliberal capitalism, but it really shouldn't be. So I think we have to fight it, you know, in terms of the way we think about housing, the thing about value, what we value, and at these multiple levels, you know, policies, but on the ground, community organizing, but also just, you know, the ways in which the state in the UK and in the US is operating, in the sense that, you know, in the case of the Pruitt Igoe and the articles that I read, you had the federal state put it in, and then it had to, the city had to pay for it from the welfare, but there wasn't enough money. And the same happens in the UK. You say, okay, you go to your council, you say, like, you know, why are you just getting rid of libraries, and why are you selling off this land which had public housing on it? And they say, well, we don't have enough money because of austerity that comes from the government, right? So all the local councils have to make various cuts, and you see that is so unequal across the country. And so you have, like the woman in the documentary who's a community organizer saying, you had this loop, so you're going around and the blame gets passed around. So I think it's really important to sort of dive into the various levels of not only, you know, so much of the Tory government are landlords, and not on a tiny scale, on a huge scale. So they're very much invested. And so you can see where the power lies and who they care about and who they don't. And that's why I love cinema and TV in terms of like showing you some of that, which is why when I was teaching sociology before, I used to try and get everyone to watch The Wire. So if you want to watch it, you know, it's from a while ago, but you get to see inside all of these different layers of power, inside the police, inside the housing, education, the poor, you know, and also everyday life. So I think that trying to see all of a kind of multiplicity of voices and experiences and perspectives to try and understand this complex issue is really important.
I think The Wire was one of the single best examples of, you know, at least the American urban setting, like what are the problems that are wrong that are happening in the city? Everything from the politics to the housing to the crime and corruption, drugs. It really does give, and the fact that it was never really celebrated when it was on in the early 2000s is shocking to me, because I think a lot of what we're seeing today continually is reflected in that show. There's a lot that could be done. The question always comes down is, do we have the will to do it? There's elements of capitalism that basically want to block these housing projects, or any type of government assistance, not looking once again at the long-term effects about how more expensive it will be to house and correct these problems on the back end, as opposed to giving people, making sure that every citizen has access to healthcare, education, and healthcare, education, and housing. We spend so much, we waste so much money on the back end because we refuse to do the have basic human empathy for anyone who has anything less than us. And that stigma is something that permeates every aspect of our society. We look down on people who are coming from the projects. We look down on people who are in programs like Section 8, where they have government assistance. There's certain places, I used to have friends who had food stamps. They were on government assistance. And I remember them being very embarrassed about going into the supermarket and paying for food with these government checks that they'd have. And a lot of that somehow needs to change. And the government has to start working for the people. And that's ultimately what the problem is that capitalism, a large money prompts people. Money over people.
Well said, James. And I think certainly if people aren't aware of the idea of universal basic income, which is being tried out actually in a lot of Scandinavian countries and places like that, certainly that would speak to what you said. I'm going to invite Nell next to say a little bit about her question to the panel.
Yeah, it's a little bit jumbled, and sort of left my head a little bit, but I've got some notes. Like, I was thinking about how you're saying people tend to treat things that aren't theirs badly, but I was just thinking about how the fact that like if you treat anything, it sort of like puts your ownership on it a little bit. And I was wondering if people's like destruction of their own homes and the place they're living in was a kind of a way of trying to like regain ownership. Because I remember hearing a quote like, "He who can destroy the thing owns the thing," which is kind of like what the Cold War is about, like who can destroy the world, who owns the world. But yeah, I was wondering if it was sort of like, yeah, I can't remember what my question was. But like, yeah, if that could be turned around, so like if people could be given the ability to, instead of taking ownership by destroying it, if they could be given the capacity to then like maintain it, maybe not maintain it themselves, but sort of like have more of a say on how it's maintained, does that then give them, is that the solution? Like sort of, does that like solve the problem of like, yeah, ownership and maintenance and all that? Because they kind of tie in like the idea, because that was like the main two ideas that I saw was like the power and ownership of the thing.
Oh, I think we've just lost Nell's audio. Is that just me? Or yeah, I'm sorry, Nell, we've lost your audio. I'm not sure why. But I think you've asked a really profound question there, and a really intriguing one about, yeah, like, is there this kind of interesting dynamic of owning something by destroying it? Luce, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was thinking, it's interesting. It's true. Like, I think to the one end, you can say, yeah, if people are involved in maintenance and care, then maybe they feel more ownership over a place. But of course, in this neoliberal capitalist world, that turns into free labor for whoever rents out the place, right? So it's a dangerous, well, you know, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because at the same time, it's like, we are not going to change the system that rapidly. So it's an interesting way of organizing. I think that you can make these things happen, but at the same time, it can be a bit problematic. So there is a balance there, I think, but it's definitely interesting. And I think I'm not entirely sure that feeling ownership is fully necessary in that sense to take care of it. Like it will help, of course, but I think feeling part of it to some extent, feeling part of a community, of wanting to care for each other, I think it's more important than wanting to care for, because by doing you care for the place by caring for each other, I think, in this way. Yeah.
Thanks, Luce.
Yeah.
Do any of the other panelists want to jump in on that very interesting question?
You know, regaining some type of ownership, people have to have pride in where they live. But part of that pride comes in displaying that they do have, you know, that if you see the place around you not maintained well, over time, you just get this kind of like, well, that's just kind of how it is. And this is not just for poor people. Let me explain that. And maybe I've missed that. I haven't articulated that clearly enough. Imagine if they stopped picking up garbage in any part of the city, whether it be the richest part of the city or the poorest part of the city. Go a week without them picking up the garbage and see how basically people start to react. I've seen it here in parts of New York City and areas that are extremely expensive, where I remember one year we had a garbage strike, and how it permeated how people's, the way that they reacted was less than, like, I don't own this. This isn't a nice place to be. So, you know, there needs to be consistent help, in my opinion, to maintain our society. That's the single most important thing that any government should do, is to maintain the society and make sure that the people maintain some level of safety and protection. If they can't do that, why the hell do we need them? You know, at least in the US, everything always boils down to money. And I'm not anti-capitalist. I like getting paid as much as the next brother. However, there needs to be time when you have money set aside to handle the things that no single individual can basically do. And there seems to be a pushback throughout various governments to move away from that, to privatize everything, to let the free market handle it. To go back to the initial question, how do we get people to take more ownership? Part of it may be policies that, you know, have people maintaining, actually dealing with the I don't know, but those are things that need to happen. There needs to be ownership on both parts. The government has to help out, and there needs to be policies that don't inhibit or prevent people from maintaining these type of housing systems.
Yeah, that's really interesting, James, that you mentioned that, because it also, what you just said triggered to me this troubling theory called broken windows theory that some of you may have heard of. That's like the idea that you know, if there is things, there are things that are not repaired, you know, there's a broken window essentially at the center of the theory. That breeds more messiness and it breeds more disrespect and things like that. Now, it's a really interesting theory because it sounds quite progressive, that, like, you know, we should tidy things up and look after things so that they're good for everyone. But interestingly, that theory's been used in quite a repressive way, I think, as well. And one of the things that was interesting in the movie was people talked about like the noise and the like the fun and the chaos of the, you know, the play outside and things like that. And so it's kind of also, to me, I suppose, interesting, like, how can we take care of things but not in a repressive way, and how can we how can we respect people's ability to express themselves in their space and in their place in ways that might look messy to outsiders to that space. So yeah, really interesting stuff there, I think, to reflect on. I've got quite a few questions in the chat, and I see Diego's made it back. I think your connection went down, did it, Diego?
Yes, I'm sorry. So I lost the questions that I had on the chat. So I think Abby, possibly you know better now.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Sorry
yeah,
about that.
I was going to ask just a couple of interesting comments that have come up in the chat. Tian, did you want to speak to your comment at all that you've put in the chat? I'm not sure if Tian's able to hear me there. So yeah, Tian had said basically that it's sort of interesting to think about whether the failure is the building itself, right, the way it's structured. And I know those of you who've actually been inside these high-rise type of building, it's very tempting to say it's just the building, and if we designed it differently, it could be successful. Or is it man-made factors or human factors? And Tian's listed a few there. Would any of our panelists, and I know Luce, you've got you're a trained architect, how would you come down on that one?
I think Miranda wants to say something too. Let's
oh, please.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think just combining the last question with this one, I just think, like, you know, you're paying 2/3 of your income on your housing and there's rubbish everywhere, that things aren't fixed, like nothing works. Like, I would definitely start smashing things. Like, I mean, there was one night of good weather in March and I live next to Heaton Park, and people went out there that night, loads of people after lockdown, left everything there. And then the next day, the Chronicle, the local paper, had the headline like "The Night of Shame." You know, it's like very easy to moralize about stuff, and I get very annoyed about it. But in terms of the housing or not, it's really interesting in terms of in London, you've got these two buildings by Erna Goldfinger, brutalist architect for ages. You know, people thought, oh, those towers, they're ugly, la la la, don't want to live there. But obviously everything, you know, fashion changes, people love it. And then now you've got two buildings. One of them is now private development and the other one is not, and still has mixed residents there. Why? Because the council owned one and the other one was a housing co-op. What happened with the council one? Obviously, kind of it's the same story. They stopped caring about the residents, stopped servicing anything, made it, they put, it's like managed decline. And you're gonna, if you haven't already learned about the rent gap, it's gonna happen. You make things so bad that for the next people, so they can sell it off and make loads of money in terms of the gap between the kind of the previous value and the new value. And that's why gentrification happens. And it's kind of mad because it's the same architect, it's the same building. One of them still has got you know, mixed income and people inside it because they became a housing co-op. And that's another really interesting thing to learn about, is the various kinds of ownerships and ways of living together. In the UK, it's really not the same to, like Luce can talk about, the Netherlands and Germany and other European countries that have a way, like it's much more common, and there's loads of different kinds of varieties and levers. But there's also a really cool development in London that took ages called Older Women's, it's called Ouch, but it's older women got together to create housing that could be affordable and they could live together in old age. And then anyway, there's so many different interesting ways to live together. And I think the form of the building, you know, I've lived in tower blocks, it was like hospital accommodation. It doesn't, you know, it was amazing when you moved in and you're on the high floor and you could see across the whole city. It's just like, wow, this is incredible. And people know each other and it's amazing. But yeah, if it's freezing and you've got no hot water, and there's rubbish everywhere and there's fire, like, that's something else, isn't it? So I just, oh yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, and it's also, you can see it, right? Like these kind of places, these kind of designs work really well in other places. So saying they don't work because of the design, I think it's such a weird thing to do. It's what Miranda said and what James said also. It's managed decline in that way. It's making it happen. And I think it's interesting also, because these things get lost in a way, right? So especially when things get demolished or when they get massively gentrified, the knowledge of how that happened kind of gets lost, because the story that is told is the story of the demolition, is the story of how terrible it was and there was no fixing. And the story of these women who are community organizing, or the story of actually how these policies happened, like that no men were allowed to live there. These kind of things, they get lost. These stories are not told. And then like it sounds like the building is the problem and the demolition was the solution. Whereas if, yeah, I mean, we have a in Netherlands, you have Bijlmer, right? So this is like Amsterdam Southeast, and it's like a very famous case. It's a bit in a similar time as Biker here in Newcastle. And it's probably famous for people because a plane flew into it at some point. It was an accident. So this is very terrible, of course, in itself. But it was I was, as an architecture student, always told the same kind of narrative as happened with this Pruitt Igoe. It's like, it was terrible, it was bad, and there was a lot of crime, so we should demolish it because it wasn't great. And then I start learning about it, and it turns out that actually the whole policy in Amsterdam was, for example, that only 10% of a street could have the people of color living there that were, well, actually very particular people coming from Suriname at that moment because of independence, coming to the Netherlands. And so they kind of didn't have a place to live. So they kind of started moving into the Bijlmer. And then the whole narrative starts about like how the Bijlmer is a terrible place. It's policies that we are all responsible for. And it makes me, you can see, it makes me really angry, because I think very often it's also policies designed by certain people, let's to rule over other people. And whether they are malicious by consciously or like by sort of not really understanding what the implications are, let's leave it in the middle. But like, you do things to people when you design these policies, and it has, in the US and in the UK and also in the Netherlands, it's usually white people doing it to black people, or rich people doing it to so it's very, I find it, it's very you can't say it's the building. So also you can't say the building, like building a certain type of building is going to solve these problems, right? We are in a society, the building is not going to solve anything. It's part of creating, it's part of a bigger system.
And I absolutely agree. It has nothing to do with the physical structure. It has a lot to do with the individual policies. One of the places where I lived for a number of years, Stuyvesant Town, I mentioned that earlier. There was a sister development that was built in the Bronx. The exact same architect, same architecture, and I posted a link to this on the chat, called Parkchester. Parkchester and Stuyvesant Town looked exactly the same. Exactly the same. The management of the way both places were managed were very different. And there was some absolutely racist aspects of how these policies were enacted. Stuyvesant Town, for a long time, Black people couldn't move in. It wasn't explicitly listed on the documentation, but there were no Black people who lived in Stuyvesant Town for numbers of years because they were literally excluded. And that happened over time also in Parkchester as well. And some of these policies that they put into place, and as they start to change them, are made in a way to make certain demographics look bad. And that they can then turn around and point to say, we tried it with them, it didn't work, let's privatize this. They tried to privatize Stuyvesant Town. The only reason I was able to get in is because at the time I worked for a company that ran the development. I worked for MetLife. And before I left MetLife, I called in a lot of favors from people who I knew, who liked me, who let me and my family slide in the door. And I stayed there as long as I did because we kept hoping that it would go co-op and that I would basically, well, quote unquote, reverse gentrify the area. So, these policies that are put in place are done for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes for financial gain, sometimes because of, racial animus towards individual groups, a combination of the two. I don't know. I've started to lose hope personally about whether or not these things can be changed, because there's so much ingrained ignorance. And what it's in the last 4 years, definitely in the US with our past president, I don't know if it's going to change. And that comes once again from not having an educated populace who can critically look at things, who can think critically. And I don't mean to end on a downer, but yeah, that's where I'm kind of at on this.
Well said, James. And I think it's interesting, as we're trying to pull this over to the UK context, I've just noticed a comment from Zan, and Zan is our head of department, head of planning, who many of you've met over the last few days, and some of you've met in previous years of study. But Zan, did you want to comment a little bit on that issue of density in our housing market?
Well, I think one of the things I find interesting about shaping towns and cities, which you're just about to do some of the first year, I think, is that we actually look at sort of policies and how things have come about. And what one also looks at is the urban form that it creates. And the urban form is created as an expression, I think, of what matters to us. And if we think that in dense cities, which are circumnavigated with green belts, is important, then that pushes up land values and those sorts of things. If we then marketize our offer and have developers provide all the housing, then one ends up with very dense units. We have a fairly weak planning system at the moment, and what we're seeing is the build out of that, and of current housing as an expression of that. There's very little affordable housing. There's very little of what we actually really need. Instead, what we have is very small housing units, which are not good, which are not really good environments. And if I'm honest, I feel like I'm watching us build sort of an expensive, slum cities again. That the intensity of what we're building at is not necessarily good for health or for any of those reasons. But it's what we're focusing on. What we're focusing on is housing units, not houses as homes, high density, and protect the greenbelt. So you see what's important to us, and by us I mean a particular group of us, sort of foisted upon the whole of society. And I think another thing, just sort of thinking about it really, and I'm just checking out a whole bunch of things to think about really, is that we've got less, that our societies, both America and the UK, have become a lot less equitable. We are moving away from a more equitable society when we were moving towards a more equitable society in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Well, probably 70s and 80s. And then we sort of shifted since then to less and less equitable solutions. And we're seeing that also in quite a lot of what's happening at the moment. And I think a bit that it favors our governments to generate crises, and then they can respond to that crises. A bit on the opposite from Panelist Miranda. I want a bit of boring in the middle, a bit of boring sort of stuff which actually can go on strategically for a long time to come up with some solutions which actually can occur. But whenever we have anything which is supposed to be long term at the moment, it doesn't last more than 8 years. And that's not really long term enough to actually address the affordable housing shortage we've got. And I think our co-ops are great. I think all of those things are great. And I really hope they all work, but I don't think we're going to do enough of it. I don't think we're going to do enough of it for the volume of what we actually need.
Thanks, Zan. That's really great to sort of bring it home and also bring it towards what those of you are going to be sort of embarking on in terms of your studies of the UK planning system and beyond. I've put a few useful readings in the chat, and we're starting to draw to a close now. And I think you know, I just wanted to extend a massive thanks to our panel. You know, really great conversation that we've had here today. Diego, did you want to wrap things up and say a final comment or two?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just say, well, to reiterate again, the thanks to the panelists, James, Luce, and Miranda. This has been recorded, so we'll upload it onto the campus communities. So you can, if you haven't seen it, you can see it there. We'll also include the Canopy link for the film, so you can watch it or rewatch it on your own. Although I guess these comments that I'm making are for those that are not here. So yeah, I would say thank you, everyone. Thank you also, Sam, for coming and contributing to the conversation. And it's been great. Yeah, we'll see you soon around campus or on Zoom.
And I'm sorry, Robert Reed, that we didn't get to your question. I'm really sorry. I just saw your thing in the chat, and I'm so sorry that we ran out of time. But feel free to email me that question, and I'll forward it to James. And I'm sure you wouldn't mind answering, would you, James?
Not a problem. Not a problem.
So thanks again. Thanks to our panel, and thanks everybody for coming.